And I'm delighted to say that Lisa Nandy joins me now, I think from College Green. Lisa, good morning to you.
Morning, Alastair.
It's a busy old morning. Let me start first with Russia and the report that fairly well briefed, I suppose, in the Times and in the Telegraph and elsewhere. But in your view, is this more embarrassing for Vladimir Putin or for Boris Johnson?
Well, I genuinely don't know what the Russia report is going to say. I imagine that it will reveal some details about interference in British elections. And I think whether it's embarrassing for Boris Johnson will depend on what he does next. I think the government has been desperately slow to wake up to the threat that is posed to British democracy by the Putin administration. We know before the report is even published that there have been repeated concerns, not just about interference in British elections and referendums, but also in US democracy, in democracies across Europe. And it seems quite extraordinary that the government is still taking a very incoherent, inconsistent approach to Russia. On the one hand, we've just had the Magnitsky legislation, which seeks to sanction Russian officials who have gained money through human rights abuses from putting that money as a safe haven into the UK. But on the other hand, we've got UK Export Finance, another branch of government that is underwriting the activities of Gazprom, President Putin's state-backed oil and gas company.
Did you take a conscious decision, Lisa, yesterday when you responded to Dominic Raab's announcement on Hong Kong, much of which you welcomed, to then give, and I was sitting watching it, listening to it live, it was a very comprehensive, and don't take this wrong, it's a very long list of other things that you wanted now. You went in with all guns blazing rather than perhaps a traditional slowly catch your monkey approach. It's that significant? Sea change time?
I think that, in relation to the actions of the Chinese government, we've seen a pattern of behaviour. It's not just the fact that they're undermining the joint declaration, which is our promise to the people of Hong Kong to protect their freedoms and democracy as well, but it's the treatment of the Uyghur people, those chilling scenes that we've seen from the Xinjiang province and the aggression in the South China Sea. And it's just simply asking for a much more consistent approach from government towards the Chinese government. Sanctions on Chinese officials, for example, that are involved in the persecution of the Uyghur people, seems to me there is absolutely no reason why the government shouldn't be taking that approach. London should not be a safe haven for the corrupt, what Dominic Raab himself calls the blood money of people who are involved in those sorts of human rights abuses. And we've got to stand up and take a consistent approach across the world.
You slapped down in an elegant way, but you did it very firmly when Dominic Raab, with a glint in his eye, said, "Oh, it's good to hear constructive, sensible stuff coming from the other side," as it were. You put him in his place over that point. But I'm going to risk being slapped down as well. This is a sea change. And I was saying to somebody else earlier on, I remember the little Mao's little red book exchange between John MacDonnell and George Osborne several years ago. I witnessed something fundamentally different yesterday, and that is a constructive Labour opposition on foreign policy where you believe Raab is getting it right, albeit with your list of Nandy caveats.
Well, I think that probably sums up quite well what we're trying to do. National security has to be at the heart of foreign policy, and where we think the government is getting it wrong, I make no apology for challenging them to set that right. But also, of course, we'll support the Foreign Secretary when he is getting it right. We urged him to bring forward the Magnitsky legislation, for example. He did that. We welcomed it. We asked him to ban the export of riot gear. My colleague Emily Thornberry, the Shadow International Trade Secretary, was pressing for that to be banned to Hong Kong. And they did that. We welcome that. And we will support the government where they're getting it right. But at the moment, we just need a far more consistent approach from across government. Sure. Dominic Raab may be taking these steps. But if you look over towards the Treasury, for example, they're very much looking to China for investment post-COVID. We've got to have a proper assessment of the implications for our national security before we accept that investment. It's not to say close the door. We need a relationship with China and we want a relationship with China, but national security has to come first.
Is it time, Lisa, final question, to revert to something that Robin Cook referred to all those years ago when Tony Blair came into power as an ethical foreign policy? And do you believe that with Raab and Johnson and Nandy and Starmer, the United Kingdom may embrace such a notion?
My view is that we haven't really had a foreign policy in Britain for a decade. Since William Hague left office as the Foreign Secretary, what we've had is an approach to the rest of the world that is seen solely through the lens of growth and trade and trying to attract investment to Britain. It's what led Cameron and Osborne to hail what they called the golden era of Sino-British relations. And it meant that we weren't alert enough to the very aggressive behaviour that we've started to see from the Chinese government. I think that is starting to change, and it's partly starting to change because of pressure from the Tory backbenches, but it's also starting to change because of pressure from the Labour Party. And if Johnson and Raab respond to that pressure, we will support them. But we need to see them take a much more coherent and consistent approach.
And on the Tory I said last question, but I'll allow myself one little add-on because I know you're kind and generous in that respect. It would have been odd to have predicted even a couple of years ago that your generation of Labour leaders would find in Tobias Ellwood and Tom Tugendhat soul brothers on many of these issues of foreign policy.
I mean, I think there are differences between our position and the Conservative backbenches. Obviously, we share a very strong concern about the persecution of the Uyghur people and want to see more action on that. And we want to see the government take national security considerations more seriously. But there are voices on the Tory benches, perhaps not Tobias Ellwood and Tom Tugendhat, but others who seem to believe that this is some kind of Cold War where the UK is being squeezed between the US and China, and we have to choose the United States. I believe we have to choose Britain, and our position is that what the UK ought to be doing, as we've seen through Huawei being squeezed in that trade war between the US and China, is developing our own homegrown alternatives and developing alliances across the world with other democratic nations, Australia, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and others, to make sure that we have our own alternatives, a third pole on the landscape, if you like, and that we can speak from a position of strategic independence so that we're not outsourcing our decisions about national security to anyone, whether it's China or the United States. I think there is a difference there in our approach, but where we can find alliances, we will build them, and we'll do it in the interests of Britain.
Lisa Nandy, good to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed for finding time for us. That's Lisa Nandy, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary on China, Russia, and perhaps a new tomorrow.